East African history, the establishment of German rule in Tanganyika. The establishment of German rule in Tanganyika. Just like British rule, the Germans established their rule by using several methods which included use of force. This involved direct military confrontation with societies that tried to resist German rule, e.g. the Hihi, Bashiri, and Ngoni, Maji were all defeated through use of force. Treaty signing. Karl Peters, a German trader and imperialist, was instrumental in signing a agreements, e.g. he signed with chiefs of Usagara, Uzikia, and Uzambara. Use of collaborators. These were used to spread German rule in Tanganyika, e.g. Chief Mera of Sangu and Mangi Mandela of Kilimanjaro. Intimidation and threats. These were used to scare off those who wanted to rebel. Resistors were severely beaten, beheaded, or hanged, e.g. even after Chief Imkol of the Hihi had shot himself, the Germans cut off his head and sent it to Berlin, Germany. Use of traders and trading companies, e.g. Karl Peters and his trading company Gico. These funded the German administration and provided the initial manpower. Development of infrastructure. Several transport networks were constructed like roads and railway lines in order to conform to the doctrine of effective occupation and to enable German consolidation of colonial rule, e.g. in 1891 a railway line was built connecting the coast to Lake Tanganyika. Use of Christian missionaries. Through their wonderful preachings, they softened the hearts and minds of the Africans, which made them ready for colonial rule, e.g. the Berlin Roman III missionaries. Use of explorers. These were used in the initial stages of colonialism, e.g. Jacob drew a sketch map of East Africa, and Dr. Livingstone reported about slave trade, and all these called for a European need to come to East Africa. Construction of military posts. These were mainly put up by Karl Peters in the total 2. ATG in Uluguru, Usagara, Uvins, and these were later used by German administrators. Divide and rule. This was mainly used in areas where Africans were rivaling each other for supremacy, e.g. Karl Peters used Arabs to fight the Bashiri soldiers who were fellow Arabs. Use of gifts and incentives. Such were used in areas where collaborators helped the Germans extend colonial rule, e.g. chiefs of Usagara were all given gifts to accept colonial. East African history, the establishment of German rule in Tanganyika. Under this system, the traditional chiefs lost their power and authority to the Ikadas and Jums, who were Africans but of Asian origin from the coast. The system was dictatorial and ruthless, and hence it led to a lot of resentment from the Africans. Why the Germans applied direct rule? The Germans believed that it was the only system through which they could effectively administer Tanganyika. They also believed that it was the only way that they could effectively exploit resources within Tanganyika. The Germans had used force to take over many parts of Tanganyika, and therefore soldiers had to be used so that Africans wouldn't easily revolt. The Germans wanted to impose their superior culture over the Africans, and this would involve imposing their culture and legal system. The Germans were also a proud people and therefore used their system to stand high and above the Africans. The Germans had suffered early revolts and therefore had to bring in the harsher Ikadas and Jums to tame the Africans. In many societies, there were no chiefs, and where they existed they were not faithful or powerful enough, and therefore the Germans had no one to entrust authority with. They opted for this system because they had enough manpower to man all departments and thus saw no need to recruit Africans in colonial administration. The Germans also feared the expenses of training Africans before they could take over administration because this could strain their budget. The Germans were very selfish and didn't want to share the exploited resources with the Africans, and that is why they used direct rule. The Germans also used direct rule because of their inexperience in colonial administration, because they had just started acquiring colonies. The Germans also feared using indirect rule that was being used by their rivals British, because this was going to increase rivalry and competition among them. How direct rule worked, or the nature of direct rule. East African history, the establishment of German rule in Tanganyika. In 1904, there was the Governor's Council that was set up to advise the governor. For efficient administration, the Germans divided Tanganyika into districts, and by 1914 they were 22. Each district was under a district officer called Bezirkshauptmann, with a police force and a small army to maintain law and order. District officers acted as judges and appointed chiefs to preside over courts and administer punishments on their behalf. They were also the highest court of appeal. Districts were further divided into counties, which were further split into sub-counties, and sub-counties into villages of 20,000 to 30,000 people. Areas that showed hostility to German rule were put under military rule, e.g. by 1914 the two districts of Iringa and Mahinj were under military rule because they were chaotic. The governor, district officers, and members of the Governor's Council were all whites. Therefore the whites dominated the top positions and the Africans were left to rule at the lower levels. Below the district officers were the Swahili Arabs called Akidas, and below the Akidas were the Jums, who were in charge of the villages. Akidas and Jums were in charge of tax collection, supervision of cotton schemes and public works. They were also supposed to appoint and dismiss junior chiefs and presided over local courts of law. Many local chiefs were stripped of their powers and were replaced by Akidas and Jums, and in areas where no chiefs existed, the Germans just appointed the Akidas in place. These turned out to be very harsh and brutal to fellow Africans, and in the end, they made German administration very unpopular. German administration was characterized by maladministration, cruel methods of tax collection and forced labor on road construction, communal cotton growing areas that cooperated with the Germans. They were left with their local chiefs, e.g. in Nyamwezi land, but these chiefs were made Akidas and therefore served the governor. In some areas, puppet chiefs were put into authority to promote German interests, e.g. in Uzambara after the death of Chief Samboja and in Onanium after the death of Chief Isaac. In their administration, the Germans were arrogant and isolated themselves from the Africans. East African history: the establishment of German rule in Tanganyika. German rule came to an end in 1919 when the League of Nations granted Britain authority over Tanganyika because Germany was being punished for causing World War I 1914-1918. Effects of direct rule in Tanganyika. Many African chiefs were stripped of their powers and replaced by the harsh Akidas and Jums. Africans who were cooperative and loyal to the Germans were appointed as Akidas. Direct rule brewed widespread rebellions as people rose up against the harsh Akidas and Jums rule, e.g. Maji Maji Revolt, Bashiri Revolt, and Hihi Rebellion. There was a rise in African nationalism because many people started organizing themselves into revolutionary movements to struggle for independence. Heavy taxation was introduced, e.g. a hut tax, 3 rupees, and taxes were brutally collected as the German tried to fully exploit the Africans and maximize profits. There was forced cash crop growing introduced by the Germans, e.g. they started forced cotton growing, which irritated the Africans. Africans lost large chunks of land to the German settlers who introduced plantation farming. People, including chiefs, were brutalized and humiliated as they were publicly flogged and beaten by the harsh Akidas and Jums. African cultures and customs were eroded and abused by the Akidas, e.g. they always raped women when their husbands were working on cotton farms, and they would also enter mosques with dogs. People were always in a state of suffering as there was widespread discontent and resentment against the Akidas and Jums and generally the whole German administration. Christianity was widespread as traditional beliefs, and Islam greatly declined as a result of shrines being burned and churches widely built by German missionaries. There was heavy loss of lives and destruction of property as the Germans tried to suppress the many rebellions. Africans were forced to work for long hours on European farms and road works where they received little or no pay at all. Infrastructures were widely developed in Tanganyika to aid the exploitation of resources. East African history: the establishment of German rule in Tanganyika. Western civilization was promoted as a result of many schools that were constructed by the Germans. The British administration in Tanganyika. Changes introduced by the British after 1919. Having lost World War I 1914-1918, Germany was forced to surrender her overseas colonies to the League of Nations. Tanganyika became a mandated territory, and the League of Nations mandated Britain to administer Tanganyika on her behalf in 1919. They began their administration of Tanganyika by appointing Sir Horace Barrett as a new British governor, and he was assisted by 4 members of the executive. In his administration, Barrett retained the Akidas and Jums and generally the whole German administration. He was later accused of failing to put Tanganyika back on a serious recovery track, and he was thus replaced by a new governor, Sir Donald Cameron, in 1925. Cameron embarked on developing Tanganyika, and he started by instituting indirect rule to close the gap between the people and government which had been created by the Germans. In 1926, he established the Native Authority Ordinance and set up legislative councils on which Africans were represented. Africans were empowered to collect taxes, administer justice, and carry out some administrative duties, e.g. they were made secretaries for the native affairs to supervise themselves. In 1926, Cameron established the Tanganyika Legislative Council, comprising of 13 official and 7 unofficial members, to formulate new laws governing Tanganyika. However, Cameron frustrated Africans by not including them on the Legislative Council yet. Settlers were included, and Africans only participated in politics at a lower level. This later provoked the young mission-educated people to rise against the British rule. This brought in many problems for the British, who even failed to get labour when they badly needed it. The colonial government had to come in and regulate wages for the Africans to be protected at work. East African history: the establishment of German rule in Tanganyika. Transport was developed, i.e. roads and railway lines were extended to productive areas, e.g. the Tabora Mwanza and Dar es Salaam Kigoma railway lines were built and repaired. Cameroon also introduced poll tax on top of the hot tax that had been introduced by the Germans, except that it was now collected by African chiefs and slightly reduced rates. Trade was developed within Tanganyika and with outside countries, and Africans fully participated. E.g., the Dar es Salaam Kigoma railway line promoted trade with Belgian Congo. Cameroon also developed the mining industry, e.g. in Musoma and Mwanza and Jata gold deposits were exploited, and this increased government revenue. The British also developed the education sector and increased government funding of education, e.g. in 1925 a Department of Education was set up and many schools were